Lieutenant Walter G. Jeffrey, U.S. Navy, was the authorized patrol plane commander for Flight PBM-5, Bureau Number 59225, Squadron Training Number 49, on the evening of December 5, 1945. He was an ATU instructor and patrol plane commander whose flight log indicates a total of 1,917.8 hours flying time. U.S. Naval Reservists Lieutenant Harry G. Cohn, Ensign Roger M. Allen, and Ensign Lloyd A. Eliason were Jeffrey's co-pilots. The three of them had completed the required ground training syllabus for advanced training in VPB-type aircraft and were undergoing instructions in VPB-type advanced training. Fellow Naval Reservist Ensign Charles D. Arseneau was the authorized and assigned radar officer for the flight. The crew also included more Navy personnel and Naval Reservists, such as Seaman First Class Alfred J. Zwicky, Aviation Ordnanceman 3rd Class James F. Osterheld, Ordnanceman 3rd Class John T. Mendez, Seaman First Class Philip B. Neiman, Aviation Radioman 3rd Class James F. Jordan, Aviation Radioman 3rd Class Robert C. Cameron, Seaman First Class Wiley D. Cargill, Aviation Machinist Mate, and finally, Aviation Machinist Mate First Class Donald E. Peterson. All 8 of them had completed the ground training syllabus for advanced training in VPB-type aircraft, and were undergoing advanced combat aircrew training for the same aircraft type. They were members of the Combat Aircrew 88G. Peterson was authorized and assigned plane captain of the aircrew, and was checked and certified as qualified to solo as plane captain in PBM-type aircraft on the 22nd of October. The officers and men comprising Combat Aircrew 88G had obtained approximately 160.1 hours flight time as an operating crew in PBM-type aircraft. Mere minutes after the loss of Flight 19, the crew of the twin-engine Martin PBM-5 Mariner diverted from a regularly scheduled night navigation training flight. With 12 hours of fuel, they departed from U.S. Naval Air Station Banana River, Florida, at approximately 1927 hours, 7:27 p.m. on the 5th of December, 1945, as Squad Training Number 49, on an authorized air-sea rescue search mission. They were one of 2 mariners dispatched with rescue equipment. Once in the air, they proceeded 29 degrees north along the east coast of Florida towards New Smyrna Beach, and then out over the ocean to expand their search square. Less than a half hour after takeoff, Trainer 49 radioed the tower that they were nearing Flight 19's last assumed position. At 1930 hours, 7:30 p.m., just 3 minutes into their flight, an "out" report was sent by radio and received by the Naval Air Station at Banana River. No further communications would ever be received from the plane or any of its 13 crewmen. The hourly position report from Training Number 49, due at 2030 hours, 8:30 p.m., was not received. At 21:15 hours, 9:15 p.m., the merchant tanker SS Gaines Mills reported that at 1950 hours, 7:50 p.m., the crew had observed a burst of flames in the sky, apparently an explosion. Leaping flames were spotted some 100 feet in the air, about 30 miles east of Cape Canaveral, off Smyrna Beach. The fires on the ocean surface reportedly burned for 10 minutes. The ship was passing through a large pool of oil at 2019 hours, 8:19 p.m., and circled the area using searchlights, looking for survivors. However, neither survivors nor wreckage were ever found. The escort carrier USS Solomons, which was also in the area, reported the following, quote, "Our air search radar showed plane after takeoff from Banana River last night, joining with another plane, then separation, and proceeding on course 045 degrees at exact time SS Gaines Mills, sighted flames in exact spot the above plane disappeared from the radar screen and never reappeared." Concentrated search operations for both Flight 19 and Training Number 49 took place from the 6th to the 10th of December under the direction of the Coast Guard headquarters of the 7th Naval District in Miami. The operations involved hundreds of ships and planes. The Navy alone ordered 248 planes, including elements of the British Royal Air Force in Nassau, into the air, along with 18 surface craft such as USS Solomons, numerous merchant ships, and other searchers. At that time, it was the biggest rescue effort of peacetime in U.S. history. More than 200,000 to 300,000 square miles of the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico, while on land it combed Florida's interior. Naval Reserve Captain Frank Daly flew in a PBY seaplane during the operation. He recalled that for, quote, 3 days, 6 hours a day, we plowed up and down the whole coast of Florida, looking for wreckage, but we never saw a thing. Lieutenant Dave White, who was a senior flight instructor at NASFL, remembered how for 3 days, he, his assistant instructor, and 20 of his students flew up and down the Florida coast at low altitudes, searching for signs of the missing airmen. They never found a trace of the airmen or the wreckage. Today, he's convinced the planes rammed into rough seas about 60 miles east of Daytona Beach. Quote, "I don't think anybody got out of their planes at all. I don't think anybody survived." He likened hitting the ocean at high speed to, quote, "hitting a brick wall." White remains mystified, as he has mentioned in relation to Flight 19, the leader was an experienced combat pilot. These were reliable planes in good condition, and it was a routine training mission. "We were alerted to look around the islands and to keep searching the water for debris. They just vanished. We had hundreds of planes out looking, and we searched over land and water for days, and nobody ever found the bodies or any debris." The aftermath of Flight 19's disappearance has left more questions than answers. It is known that the compasses on Taylor's plane malfunctioned 90 minutes into the mission. With no instruments to guide him over the open ocean, he thought the flight had drifted off course and was actually south over the Florida Keys and not the Keys of the northern Bahamas. Perhaps adding evidence to his confusion, he initially referred to himself as MT-28 instead of FT-28, his Fort Lauderdale call sign. This may have unintentionally been in reference to his old call sign. After all, he had recently arrived from operating as an instructor at the Naval Air Station in Miami. Taylor thus aimed his squadron northeast in hopes that it would lead the single-engine bombers back to Fort Lauderdale. Instead, it led the squadron out over the open Atlantic. To compound matters, the planes likely flew into stormy weather. It was reported by the airport weather station at Miami that a large area of turbulent air rolled out of a storm centered over Georgia, sweeping over Jacksonville about noon and reaching Miami by nightfall. Squalls on the surface, 40-mile winds at 1,000 feet, and full hurricane conditions of 75 miles an hour winds at 8,000 feet was recorded at 1600 hours 4 p.m. Perhaps Taylor realized his mistake and aimed the planes west towards Florida's coast, but only after it was far too late. The Avenger trainees were well coached by Navy personnel about emergency procedures. If one plane ditched, all the planes on the training mission were to ditch as well, so they could all be found together. On the radio transcripts, Taylor talks about doing this exact same thing. If the Flight 19 crew did live through the ditching of their planes, which is an unlikely assumption considering that the seas were 12 feet high and a thunderstorm was brewing by the time they went down, they would have been in life rafts, Navy officials say. In the years that David White flew out of Fort Lauderdale, none of his instrumentation ever malfunctioned. He thinks the planes crash-landed east of Florida and that the airmen died on impact or drowned in the stormy waters. As for the PBM Mariner, the search planes had such a history of accidents and were so prone to fuel leaks that they were known by the airmen that handled them as flying gas tanks. The slightest spark or a lip match could cause an explosion. The Navy halted production of these planes in 1949. Going back to the Avengers, they were known as an extremely rugged plane. Pilots sometimes call them, quote, "iron birds," or Grumman Ironworks, said Mark Evans, a historian at the Naval Aviation History Branch of the Naval Historical Center. To quote him, "They were built like tanks. Time and again they'd come back from battle all shot up and still functioning. The pilots loved them. They were also very heavy, weighing more than 10,000 pounds or 4,535 kilograms when empty. When ditched, the Avenger would go down hard and fast. The possibility of anyone surviving a landing in high seas was slim. The chance of surviving the night in the cold waters was nil. The likelihood of the wreckage making a quick descent to the bottom was high." "It was pure and simple pilot error," said Joanne Pietrucha, the niece of Howell Thompson, one of the navigators in Flight 19. "I don't believe in any wacky compasses." Lieutenant Charles Taylor was initially found, quote, "guilty of mental aberration." Later, his mother, Catherine Taylor, was successful in exonerating him of wrongdoing by filing her own investigation. Lieutenant Charles Taylor was exonerated in 1947 by the Board for Correction of Naval Records in regard to, again to quote, "responsibility for loss of lives and naval aircraft." Finally, after an extensive Navy Board of Inquiry investigation was completed, the mystery remained. The board's report is summed up in one terse statement: "We are not able to even make a good guess as to what happened." There are several more colorful theories surrounding the plane's disappearance, such as the classic alien abduction, Leviathan-esque creatures pulling them out of the air and into the depths, and even dimensional anomalies. Another theory asserts they wandered into a strong electromagnetic disturbance that interfered with their compasses. Yet another suggests oceanic flatulence, that the ocean suddenly spewed great quantities of trapped methane which took down the planes. It is safe to say that none of these have been seriously verified. In the early 1990s, John Meyer, a retired Army captain, former combat helicopter pilot, and decorated Vietnam veteran, put himself more than $100,000 in debt from search and salvage operations. He managed to accrue such debt after recovering the wreck of a TBM Avenger from 400 feet of water 30 miles off Cape Canaveral that he has for years asked the Navy to verify as one of the lost planes of Flight 19. It was initially discovered in 1986 by the Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute while searching for parts of the ill-fated space shuttle Challenger. They had found it at a spot between 2 points that Meyer had calculated as being the final resting place of Flight 19. Meyer helped to get the engine cowling of the Avenger's wreck raised to the surface in hopes of finding an identification number. The videotape he captured showed a number etched on a wing, L209. It is the closest Meyer has ever come to proving his theory. The number of Stiver's plane was 73209. Ted Darcy of Wreck Finders, a firm in Hawaii that specializes in the ocean salvage of aircraft, was brought in to review the videotapes of Meyer's plane. He concluded that the wreckage was not from Flight 19, but was from another Avenger that had crashed aboard the USS Solomons and dumped overboard. Though media attention vanished overnight, Meyer disagreed with Darcy and arranged to have the entire plane brought up to the surface in August 1991. Halfway through the salvage, however, a cable snapped, sending the plane plummeting back to the ocean floor. The wing, with its identifying number, was lost. Eventually, much of the plane, minus a tail section that has never been found, was brought to the surface and taken to Marineland. Meyer searched exhaustively for a number that could positively identify the wreckage. He found none. Aviation archaeologist Larry Webster of Massachusetts, the leading expert in identifying crashed Avengers, says none of the numbers that can conclusively identify the planes will ever be found. Quote, "I don't want to say they had amateurs down there, but they should have had somebody at the salvage who knows how to identify a plane," Webster says. The evidence has been squandered. It's lost. Without physical evidence, the Navy was unable to confirm whether the plane was indeed from Flight 19. In May 1991, the Deep Sea Salvage Organization discovered 5 Grumman Avenger fighter bombers lying in a group on the ocean floor. They were within a 1.2 nautical mile radius of one another, sitting upright and mostly undamaged 550 to 750 feet beneath the surface. At the time, the discovery caused a media frenzy. British engineer Graham Hawkes, the owner of the company, was later questioned by cameramen and interviewers who all wanted to know if the planes were those of Flight 19. The media frenzy quickly evaporated, however, when Hawkes announced that further investigation revealed that the plane's tail numbers did not match those of the long-lost flight. It just so happened that the one marked 28, the same number stenciled on the Mystery Squadron's lead plane, was the one that the explorers spotted first, he said. They learned later that the Navy often recycled the tail numbers of lost aircraft. Hawkes has since changed his story. Now he says both he, because his investors didn't want to waste valuable time on an investigation, and the Pentagon, because they had more important things to worry about, had an interest in making the story go away. Even on closer passes over the submerged planes, the high-technology remote camera that operates from Mr. Hawkes' vessel, the Deep Sea, could not detect serial numbers on any of the aircraft. But the model type suggested that most of the planes predated those lost on December 5, 1945. The explorers speculated that each plane might have crashed over a period of time, while making practice runs at a target. At least 139 of the World War II vintage Avengers have been lost off the Florida coast. After an onslaught of media attention, a deluge of offers from movie and television producers, and a legal tussle with the Navy, they said they were not sure they wanted to find any more planes. Quote, "If we find 5 more aircraft," Mr. Hawkes said, "I'm not sure we'll tell anyone." In 1989, Alan McElhenney and Frank Hill investigated a TBM Avenger crash site in the Everglades, which had been revealed after a fire. Initial speculation suggested that it was one of the planes of the famous Lost Patrol. However, it was determined not to be part of Flight 19 because the bureau number didn't match. Evidence later determined that it was flown by Ensign Ralph N. Wakeup, a Naval Reserve officer who on March 16, 1947, 15 months after Flight 19 vanished, had been flying on a navigational training flight from Miami to Tampa with 2 other planes. During the flight, the planes encountered overcast skies and heavy rain. He lost sight of his flight leader and developed a case of vertigo that would turn out to be lethal. He was killed after crashing in far western Broward County. A day after the accident, Navy officials recovered Wacom's body, investigated the accident, and left the wreckage there in the remote Everglades. 42 years later, in May 1989, the wreckage of his plane revealed itself once again, when Bob Lester, a Broward Sheriff's helicopter pilot, spotted it while flying over the glades after a brush fire burned down the tall grass, thus starting a 25-year quest to identify the mystery plane that has since borne fruit. An annual memorial ceremony commemorates the 14 crewmen of Flight 19 and the 13 crewmen from the Marina Rescue Seaplane, a total of 6 aircraft and 27 men. The ceremony is a public event celebrated on the grounds of the Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale Museum, which is on the National Register of Historic Places and the Florida Heritage Site. On October 18, 2005, U.S. Representative Clay Shaw, Republican Fort Lauderdale, sponsored a bill in Congress, H. Resolution 500, honoring the 60th anniversary of Flight 19. He said he hoped the gesture would help bring closure for surviving family members. At 10 a.m. on April 11, 2017, U.S. Representative Bill Posey joined military officials and citizens at a ceremony unveiling a bronze plaque and granite monument at Patrick Air Force Base, now Patrick Space Force Base, honoring the lost crew of Training 49. Prior to either name, the military installation was Naval Air Station Banana River. The monument overlooks an old seaplane ramp on the Banana River itself, just 50 feet away, one of the same ones that Training 49 would have taken off from for the last time 70 years earlier. Quote, "I would like to think that this monument just doesn't represent those who went out on that particular mission, but represents all those who went out on what they thought might be a training mission, only to have it be their last mission," said retired U.S. Navy Rear Admiral Samuel Cox. That's the nature of naval aviation, the nature of military aviation, is that you're never 100% sure whether this flight will be your last. A driving force behind the monument's creation was 75-year-old Sebastian resident John Meyer. "It's just something that needed doing," said Meyer, a member of the Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale Historical Association and Museum. "I'm glad I could be a part of it." Another museum member, Edgar Buddy Galvin, a 94-year-old World War II veteran who participated in the search for Flight 19, also attended the ceremony. The tragedy of Flight 19 and its ill-fated rescuers spawned the myth of the Bermuda Triangle, or the Devil's Triangle. The region didn't get its name until August 1964, when Vincent Gaddis coined the term Bermuda Triangle in a cover story for Argosy magazine about the disappearance of Flight 19. The triangle itself would spawn an entire genre of sea-bound mysteries, books, shows, and movies. The reality behind the region, however, is far more underwhelming but also far more likely. Many argue that a sometimes treacherous Mother Nature, human error, shoddy craftsmanship or design, and just plain bad luck can explain the many disappearances. Quote, "The region is highly traveled and has been a busy crossroads since the early days of European exploration," said John Riley, a historian with the U.S. Naval Historical Foundation. "To say quite a few ships and airplanes have gone down there is like saying there are an awful lot of car accidents on the New Jersey Turnpike. Surprise, surprise." Lieutenant A.L. Russell, in the U.S. Coast Guard's official response to Bermuda Triangle inquiries, writes, "It has been our experience that the combined forces of nature and the unpredictability of mankind outdo science fiction stories many times each year." Then there's the weather. Quote, "The biggest issues in that area normally are hurricanes, but it's not particularly a spawning area for storms," said David Feet, chief of the Marine Forecast Branch of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Marine Prediction Center. "If you have the right atmospheric conditions, you could get quite unexpectedly high waves. If wave heights are 8 feet outside of the Gulf Stream, they could be 2 or even 3 times higher within it. Sailors can sometimes identify the Gulf Stream by the clouds and thunderstorms over it. The Coast Guard also notes that unpredictable Caribbean Atlantic storms can yield waterspouts that often spell disaster for pilots and mariners." Former TBM pilots that were questioned expressed the opinion that an Avenger attempting to ditch at night in a heavy sea would almost certainly not survive the crash. And this, most likely, was the case for Flight 19. The aircraft most probably broke up on impact. Those crewmen who might have survived the crash would not have lasted long in the cold water and strong winds. This last element, while only an educated guess, seems to satisfy this strange and famous disappearance. This, of course, leads to my own conclusion. It is interesting to think that perhaps Flight 19, or some of its planes, might have already been discovered and simply couldn't be confirmed. Beyond that, I initially thought there were strange factors about this case. However, in all frankness, and with respect to the crew of Flight 19 and those they left behind, I find that the only mystery that still eludes me is that Lieutenant Taylor's mother managed to convince the Naval Board of Inquiry that her son's leadership was not at fault. Whether she brought up concrete arguments, or if this was done simply out of respect for the dead, I can't say for sure. What I can say is that the communication logs of Flight 19 speak for themselves, even almost 80 years after the transmissions of the last plane went radio silent for the last time.